Greetings! It's Casual Friday. Because as I've said before, hey, I'm just folks like y'all. It's Friday. It's a time of preparation. It's also the sixth day of the week during the 8 days of Hanukkah. This is the fifth day of the Feast of Dedication. And I know many of you will be seeing this on a weekly Sabbath. So if you're seeing it as a Sabbath instruction, then Shabbat Shalom to you. And Chag Hanukkah Sameach for those of you who are celebrating it. And I realize you may be seeing this at a later time. I don't know when you'll be seeing it. I hope you'll be seeing it soon. Now this is part 2 of searching the scriptures about Hanukkah. So I hope you saw part 1. If you didn't, for shame, take a look at part 1. I also want to ask you this, or recommend. Last Sabbath, we had what would the date of that have been? That would have been at the end of the November, December the 1st, right? In 2018, December the 1st was a weekly Sabbath, and the Flair Church had a service, I believe at 5 o'clock that day, and I gave a sermonette on the significance of the Sivivon, the dreidel. I think that you'll find that, since this is the Festival of Lights, I think you'll find that talk very illuminating. So go ahead and check it out if you have not. What do we call that? A shameless plug. Last week, I didn't record a message. My mother is 98 and she was critically ill. She is now recovering, and we thank you for your prayers and pray for continued prayers for her. She does face a possible long-term health issue that she'll be dealing with, but the immediate problem is she's gradually overcoming the immediate problem that she had. She took some serious falls and injured herself, and she's recovering from that. And she has recovered sufficiently that she'll be able to attend my younger son's wedding. I have 2 sons and 2 daughters. The older son is married, and the younger son will be married tomorrow. I have been to, in the Church of God, I have been to some weddings, as I recall, on the Sabbath. I remember one in the Manhattan church, or no, I guess it was in Queens. I'm sorry. It was in Queens. It was at a place called Crystal Palace. I think it's in Astoria, which used to be a Greek neighborhood, and maybe some of you attended services in Astoria during the time the church was there. And then I believe I also attended a service for a member of the church employee team. I think he may have been involved in the aviation area or perhaps in the festival area. The service was held in the Festival of Tabernacles building in Big Sandy, as I recall, in late afternoon on the Sabbath, as is my memory. Well, anyway, tomorrow on the Sabbath, I'm going to be performing a wedding for my son Jonathan and his wife-to-be, Christina. So we appreciate your prayers, and appreciate your prayers for my 98-year-old mother, who would be thrilled to be there, and at this point she'll be able to be there. So that's some family news and why it is that we didn't have a message last week from Christian Commandment Keepers. But as I said, there was a Flair message. And you can check that out if you have not. Now, if you are ever in town, and many people come to Orlando, this area, if you're ever in town, then let us know, and we can let you know the location of the Flair service on the Sabbath. We normally meet at 11 a.m. And eventually, we're going to be a bigger deal, to use a kind of colloquial term. We're going to establish, God willing, a local congregation that I hope will grow and have an impact here locally. You know, we're in the early stages of that, so we really appreciate your prayers for that, for the local congregation that we hope to. It's already here. We have what you would call, if you're a Disney fan, the soft opening. We haven't had the, major opening, but we have had already what we would call in the theme park trade the soft opening of that congregation. Now, this topic, searching the scriptures about Hanukkah, it can't be exhausted in this series that I'm doing now. It's a very fascinating subject. but I want to continue with today. And I want to begin by reminding us that Jesus, as a Jew, kept an appropriate holiday, as Christians keep appropriate national holidays in their various nations. And he kept the festival of Hanukkah, the festival of the rededication of the temple. And we find in John 10:22, now it was the feast of dedication in Jerusalem, and it was winter. And verse 23, and Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. Of course, that would have been the center of Hanukkah observance, because Hanukkah was, of course, celebrating the rededication of the temple. I'd like to go to Psalm 30. Now, I'm searching the scriptures about Hanukkah, and so I'm going through various ones, and I'm beginning today with Psalm 30, because that is a psalm of dedication. It's a psalm of Hanukkah, but not necessarily the dedication of the temple, although it's possible. It is a psalm of Hanukkah. You could look up the Hebrew there. I'll read the title in Hebrew. I have an English version in front of me. I have this Bible that's a New King James. So let me see what it says here in the New King James. It says, a psalm, a song at the dedication of the house of David. In Hebrew, that's Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid. Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid. So it's the Hanukkah. It's the dedication of the house of David. But perhaps that's a way of talking about the temple, because he was the one who wanted to build it, who got everything organized. Solomon finally built it, but in some ways it's also David's house. But in any case, I want to read a little bit of this psalm, because it is related to the history regarding Hanukkah. I will extol you, O Eternal, for you have lifted me up, and have not let my foes rejoice over me. Let's go to the fifth verse, because, to the verse that's so popular, was so popular with President, the fifth verse was very popular with President Barack Hussein Obama during his administration. President Obama quoted this verse more than once. So maybe it was a favorite verse of the pastor that he, in Chicago, whose church he used to attend. But I'm in Psalm 30, verse 5. For his anger is but for a moment, his favor is for life. And this is the part that the president used to quote. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. And Hanukkah was a time of oppression initially and terror, but then it became a time of victory and deliverance. Verse 11 of this psalm. You have turned for me my mourning into dancing. You have put off my sackcloth and clothed me with gladness, to the end that glory may sing praise to you and not be silent. What does it mean that glory may sing praise to you and not be silent? Well, perhaps it means the best of me. Whatever is most talented, most strong, strongest, whatever is the best about me will praise you. It may also refer to the time when human beings will be glorified, when we'll be in a glorified state and living eternally. That's our destiny that God wants for us. To the end that glory may sing praise to you and not be silent. O eternal my God, I will give thanks to you forever. Another psalm that is related to Hanukkah is the 149th, and I may have referred to it last week. Some scholars would claim it was written at that time. I don't think so, but the people who rebelled against Antiochus applied it to themselves. Those who fought for the Old Covenant, the Sinaitic Covenant, that it would be preserved in the Holy Land, and that the tyrant would be driven away, who was trying to destroy the Torah, who was trying to destroy it. Those who opposed him were called Hasidim, the pious ones, the saints. What is a Hasid? A Hasid is somebody who has the quality of Chesed, loving kindness. And it says in verse 5 of this Psalm 149, I'll start in the beginning. This is Psalm 149. Hallelujah! Praise the Eternal. Sing to the Eternal a new song, and his praise in the assembly of saints. In other words, the church, right? Let the saint, verse 5. Let the saints be joyful in glory. See, once again, we have this concept of glory. Let the high praises, let them sing aloud on their beds. I've talked about this before. How do you feel when you wake up in the morning? Kind of grumpy? Well, when we wake up from death to the resurrection, we'll be very excited and very happy, right? And so we'll be singing aloud on our beds. I think this may be a metaphor, a poetic way of talking about the resurrection when we come from the sleep of death into eternal life. And if you read the rest of it, you'll see how very much it applies to Hanukkah. So these are Old Testament verses that tend to be associated with Hanukkah. And I want to give a prophecy of Zechariah. Here Zechariah is shown the candelabra that was in the temple, the 7 branches. And on either side are olive branches, olive leaves. And this is or olive trees in the verse here and chapter here. And this is the symbol of the modern state of Israel. The United States has a bald eagle, with arrows in one hand and olive branch in the other, war or peace, more or less you decide, the United States deals with you as you deal with it. But we have the emblem of the United States, the Great Seal, which you find on the back of the dollar bill. And Israel has a seal, which is the menorah of the temple and olive branches on either side, coming from Zechariah 4. And what's going on here? Well, the oil in the lamp is symbolic of God's Spirit. The light is kindled it comes from oil. So the light of truth, the light of Torah, the lamp that guides our path, it comes, from God's Spirit. The oil symbolizes God's Spirit. And in Zechariah 4:6, so he answered and said to me, this is scripture Jews associate with Hanukkah. So he answered and said to me, this is the word of the Eternal to Zerubbabel, not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Eternal of hosts. In Hanukkah, we find a small guerrilla band beating a mighty army of the greatest empire of the day. A miracle. So I want to go now to a prophecy that relates to Hanukkah, perhaps, in the book of Daniel. Now, I covered Daniel 8 last time. I want to go now to Daniel 9, which bridges from the Old Testament to the New Testament, the famous 70 weeks prophecy. Now, I want to make a point to you that's very important. One time, a friend of mine came over to me and said, "What time do you wake up? In the morning?" Now, that's not how you usually ask, right? You usually say, "What time do you wake up in the morning?" Obviously, he asked it to be cute. But you see how you can manipulate with punctuation the same words. Punctuation and intonation. Well, Daniel 9 is punctuated and intonated differently in the Masoretic text than what you have in your New King James. Because what your New King James did is they went to the Septuagint. They went to the Jewish community in Alexandria, Egypt, which spoke Greek and translated the Old Testament into Greek, and they took their interpretation. And there it is, rock solid, pointing to Jesus Christ. But if you read the way the Hebrew-speaking world reads it, you're not going to draw that conclusion. And that is how the New Revised Standard Version translates it. And also, I believe, the French translation. So the words are the same. It's how you punctuate them. So we respect the Masoretic text, and we interpret it as is, but we also realize that if you look at the Septuagint version, it's right on a direct prophecy of Jesus Christ. Now, you see that in the New Testament, it's not even quoted. So I'm so sorry that some of you think that the Jews are incompetent because they can't read Daniel 9 and convert. No, the way they read Daniel 9 is not going to force them to convert. And if you look at the New Testament, Daniel 9 is not quoted there. All right, but that being said, let's look at Daniel 9 as the Septuagint translated it. And the 70 weeks prophecy, when you come to the end, it seems that it's dual. That it's talking about, yes, it's a prophecy of Christ and what he would do, but it seems to also be a prophecy of the Antichrist, the opponent. And Antiochus, who brought about, the holiday of Hanukkah by desecrating the temple, he was the type of the Antichrist, and the Antichrist is the antitype of Antiochus. So if you look at Daniel 9, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. So it seems that, perhaps 7 years before Christ returns, some kind of treaty will be made, and it will only last 7 years because by that time Jesus Christ will return and end it. But this may refer to those 10 nations that come together at the end in Revelation 17. But in the middle of the week, he shall bring an end to the sacrifice and offering. That's one way to translate it, but it could also mean for half a week. So I have a feeling that what's going on here is in the last 7 years of human history before Christ's return, we're going to have this revived Roman Empire, and for the last 3.5 years, as you know, that's the tribulation period when sacrifices will cease. And as I said, this is taking this as a prophecy of the Antichrist, which is one way to look at it, all right? And on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate. Well, Antiochus did that, and so will this tyrant at the end, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. So yes, he's going to meet his destiny, and Jesus Christ will return and conquer him. So I wanted to give you that spin on Daniel 9:27. That's obviously not a thorough discussion of that verse, but how it relates to Hanukkah. Now I want to go to Daniel 11, which more directly relates there. And here we have a prophecy, and I misspoke last week, or would have been 2 weeks ago now, almost, because I said, what's the oldest book in the New Testament according to the universities? And that was a stupid way to put it. Hopefully you understood what I meant. It's not the oldest book, but it's the book that actually would be the last one done. Not the oldest, but the last. In a way, the newest book in the New Testament. You go to a university and take a course on the Bible, and I'll help you to pass your test. Because they're going to ask you, what's the last book of the Old Testament? And it's a trick question, because the more conservative students will say Malachi. But the more erudite students are going to answer Daniel. See, Daniel is the newest book, according to the university classes, the last book of the Old Testament. It has to be that if you're an agnostic, because the prophecies are so specific. If they were written ahead of time, that proves the divine inspiration of the Bible. And so you either accept the divine inspiration of the Bible, or you assume that Daniel is in some ways almost a pseudepigraphical book. That some of these prophecies that are claimed to have been written by Daniel were written by somebody else, according to the university scholars. Now, there's evidence against that within the book, which I don't have time to deal with. The book of Daniel is very powerfully put together to witness against people who want to try to undermine it, as they do in modern universities. But that's subject for another day. I want to go to Daniel 11, talking about Antiochus. He goes to Egypt. As I recall, things don't go well for him there, so he comes back to consolidate his control over the land of Israel. Now, I want to say this about Israel. If you live in Israel, if you want to have a political entity, if you want to have a state there in Israel, you're either going to be a regional power or a doormat. That's just the way it is. It's a rough neighborhood. And in this this period of history, we had an empire in Syria and an empire in Egypt battling for control. So here we have this land bridge in between, the land of Israel. So as I said, you're either a regional power or a doormat. Remember, Mediterranean means the center of the earth. Europe, Asia, and Africa come together there. It's a very strategic spot. Whoever wants to dominate the world will want to dominate that area. For example, Napoleon, Hitler. Napoleon invaded Egypt. He spent time in the land of Israel. Hitler invaded Egypt and wanted to get as far as Israel, but he was stopped at El Alamein, and that was one of the decisive moments of the Second World War. By the way, I'm speaking on December 7th, which is, of course, the anniversary of when my country, the United States, got involved in the Second World War. But anyway, there will be, unfortunately, another world war. I hate to say that. And it will precede the coming of Jesus Christ. And at that time, there will be a tyrant who will be attempting to resurrect the Roman Empire, as Mussolini did, and then later superseded by Hitler. Here, Antiochus was a type of that final tyrant. And I'm going to go to verse 30 or so. Let's go to verse 28. While returning to his land with great riches, well, maybe he did do well in Egypt. I'm trying to recall that part. But anyway, perhaps he didn't do as well. Oh, I know. It's later on that things don't work out for him. All right. He does okay in the beginning, but in just a verse or two, he's not going to be doing so well. All right. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant. So he shall do damage and return to his own land. He began persecuting the Jews. He wanted firm control. He wanted Hellenistic people. He wanted people who would, I'll use a term, kowtow to him. He wasn't Oriental, but he wanted people who would kowtow to him. He wanted a Hellenistic Israel. And so he interfered in the priesthood. He put his own priests in charge, and one and then another. And he tried to eventually wipe out the religion of the Bible in the Holy Land, as we'll see. But anyway, we begin to see here he's acting against the Holy Covenant, verse 28. Then verse 29, at the appointed time he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. So here is where he stumbles. Things don't work out for him as he heads to Egypt this time. And that has to do with the fact of a rising power in the west, Rome. And actually, Rome at this time turns out to be a friend of the Jews. Rome is a check on the power of Antiochus. Now later on things work out differently. But here we have Rome coming in. For ships from Cyprus, I believe the Hebrew term is Kittim, so it's a question of where Kittim is, but it's the Roman fleet. For ships from Cyprus shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved, and return in rage against the Holy Covenant, and do damage. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Some people look at the festival of Hanukkah, the rebellion of the Maccabees, as more like a civil war between the Hellenistic Jews who wanted to assimilate into the world of that day and the pious ones who wanted to preserve the Sinaitic covenant. It was like a civil war. But of course the Seleucid emperor, Antiochus, intervened on the side of the Hellenists and pushed it very dramatically. And I covered that last time from Daniel 8. And now we have 4 points. This is very important because, let's hold here for just a moment and go to Matthew 24 so I don't ignore reading it. Matthew 24:13. If we want to understand end-time events, we need to review the events about Hanukkah and then see how they'll fit in the end time. Now, they may not be fulfilled in the same way, but in some way, some sense, they will. I don't know quite. I don't know quite how. I'm a bit bewildered by it all, to tell you frankly. But I tell myself, if you had been around in 1840, and somebody had said there's going to be a Jewish state before the coming of Christ, and it's going to be a major factor in world events. If you in 1840, that would have been a prospect that would have been quite debatable. Although I do have an old history book from that period, and the man there was very biblically literate, and he understood that would happen. But in any case, how could such a thing happen? It is a miracle that Zionism succeeded. And Zionism, of course, is always tenuous even now. I say it succeeded. In many ways it has, but still, as you know, the state of Israel still is subject to a lot of pressure. But it is miraculously there and thriving. And so if that has happened, there could very well be other prophecies fulfilled that seem so far out now. But yet the state of Israel itself shows how prophecies can be fulfilled that seem just very, incredible. Anyway, I'll go to Matthew 24:13, and then I'm going to jump to the 15th verse, actually. Therefore, Matthew 24:15, when you see the abomination of desolation, and the person had to add that, but that's what he's referring to, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Get out of town. Go to the mountains. Get out of town. And that hasn't happened yet. And I don't know what form it will take, but I know what happened at the time of Antiochus. And if you go to Mark 13, there's a repetition of that prophecy. So I want to go there as well. Mark 13 and verse 14. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing where it ought not, let the reader understand, and let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Well, you're going to understand by prayer, study, fasting, meditating, good works, being a good Christian. But you're also going to understand by studying what happened at the time of Antiochus. This will help us understand. So anyway, we go now back to that time, and 4 points I want to cover. Daniel 11:31. And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. So, 1, military invasion of Jerusalem, the holy city. 2, Gentiles, pagans, come into the temple and defile it. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices. 3, daily sacrifices prohibited. Okay, so invasion, defilement, taking away of the sacrifices. And then, and place there the abomination of desolation. That's the 4th point. The climax, the hideous climax of it is celebrating the sort of a pre-Christian, I should say a pre-Christmas, celebrating the birthday of the sun god on the 25th day of the 9th month. Because Antiochus called himself Epiphanes, the manifestation of God, the illuminated, so he had a statue of Zeus put in the temple. He had a statue of Zeus there, and then he had a pig sacrificed to it, just an absolute abomination. And verse 32, and there were those who supported him. Those who do wickedly against the covenant he shall corrupt with flattery. They're, let's just put it this way. When people come in to try to subvert and corrupt, this is what they do. They offer you goodies. They offer you rewards if you go along, and pressure if you don't, for that matter. Those who do wickedly against the covenant he shall corrupt with flattery. But the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out exploits. These are the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, the priests, Mattathias and his 5 sons, and those who followed them. They knew their God, and as Jesus said in John 4, we know who we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. John 4:22 to the Samaritan woman. So they were strong and carried out great exploits. And Revelation 3, I won't have time to go into it today, so maybe you'll come back for the next part of this series. But Revelation 3 talks about, yes, it's prophetic, but it's also looking back on the time of the Hasmoneans. They were the 6th era of the Old Testament church. They were the Old Testament Philadelphians, and they were small, but yet, they were, let's put it this way, no somos muchos, pero somos machos, right? We're not numerous, but we're strong. And the Maccabees, although small, had a little strength because God was with them. And so they did accomplish a great deal because they had remained faithful to the covenant. And so they did make the Judean state of that day a regional power, as it is today in the Middle East. And rather than being a doormat, it did become, for a time, a regional power. And so that, of course, is celebrated as Jews celebrate the festival of Hanukkah today. Now, I want to conclude by going to 2 Thessalonians, the 2nd chapter, which I may have quoted last time, but let's conclude there. Hanukkah is called the Festival of Lights. Antiochus called himself Epiphanes. He thought he was the Epiphany. He was a virtual divine being. And the Antichrist will be worshipped in the end time. But the Antichrist will be conquered, overcome, his empire destroyed by an epiphany, an illumination. Because Jesus Christ, who is the source of light, look at John 1, the bringer of light, the morning star. She's symbolized by the sun elsewhere. In English, you can make a nice pun. The sun, S-U-N, is also symbolizes the S-O-N, Son of God. So in 2 Thessalonians 2, in talking about this Antichrist, and then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. The epiphaneia. Look it up in a Greek text. With the brightness of his coming. And so, as we remember the events of this season, whether or not we're celebrating the festival of Hanukkah, but as we remember the events of this season, the victory that God gave his people then, we can look forward to the greatest of victories that will come with the return of Jesus Christ. So this is part 2 now of searching the scriptures about Hanukkah. And God willing, there'll be a part 3. All the best to you and yours.